There was a time when marriage meant building each other up, not tearing each other down. But what happened on Family Feud in November 2024 would expose the devastating impact of words spoken in cruelty rather than love. When Jennifer Walsh stepped onto that stage with her husband Brian, nobody could have predicted that a simple wrong answer would trigger a verbal attack so brutal that it would leave her sobbing on national television. What Steve Harvey did next would remind millions of viewers that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand between someone and their abuser. This is a story about emotional abuse, public humiliation, and why silence in the face of cruelty makes us complicit in the harm being done. Before we begin this important story about standing up against verbal abuse and defending human dignity, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories matter because they shine a light on patterns of harm that too many people experience in silence. Jennifer Walsh was 38 years old, a former marketing executive from Minneapolis, Minnesota, who had spent the last 12 years of her life trying to become small enough to avoid her husband's anger. She had been married to Brian Walsh for 14 years, and somewhere along the way, the confident woman who had graduated top of her class and built a successful career had disappeared, replaced by someone who apologized constantly, second-guessed every word she spoke, and had learned to read her husband's moods with the hypervigilance of someone living in a constant state of threat assessment. Brian Walsh, at 42, was a successful corporate attorney who projected an image of sophistication and charm to the outside world. His colleagues saw him as sharp, articulate, and professionally accomplished. Their friends viewed Brian and Jennifer as an attractive, successful couple who seemed to have it all together. What people did not see were the private moments when Brian's charm evaporated and was replaced by cutting criticism, contemptuous dismissal, and a pattern of verbal cruelty that had systematically destroyed Jennifer's sense of self-worth over more than a decade. The pattern had started subtly in the early years of their marriage. Brian would make small corrections to Jennifer's stories when they were with friends, interrupting to provide what he called the accurate version of events. He would sigh loudly when she expressed opinions, following up with explanations of why her perspective was naive or uninformed. He would critique her appearance, her cooking, her housekeeping, and her parenting in ways that were framed as helpful feedback but felt like constant evaluation and judgment. Jennifer initially tried to take the criticism constructively, working harder to meet Brian's standards and avoid his disapproval. Over time, the criticism had escalated in frequency and severity. Brian had developed a pattern of public humiliation, making jokes at Jennifer's expense in front of friends and family. He would tell stories that portrayed her as foolish or incompetent, laughing as he recounted her mistakes or misunderstandings. When Jennifer expressed hurt at these public put-downs, Brian would accuse her of being too sensitive and unable to take a joke. He would turn the situation around, making her feel guilty for being upset rather than taking responsibility for the harm his words had caused. The verbal abuse had intensified after Jennifer had made the decision to leave her marketing career to stay home with their 2 children. Brian had suggested the arrangement, saying he earned enough to support the family and that the children would benefit from having their mother at home full-time. Jennifer had agreed, though she had loved her career and had some reservations about giving it up. Once she was financially dependent on Brian, his treatment of her had worsened significantly. He would refer to her as lazy for not working outside the home, even though she managed all household responsibilities, childcare, school activities, and family scheduling. He would complain about having to support her financially, conveniently forgetting that staying home had been his idea and that her unpaid labor enabled his career advancement. Brian had also developed a pattern of undermining Jennifer's parenting and decision-making. If she set a rule for the children, he would contradict it in front of them, making her look foolish and inconsistent. If she made a mistake, no matter how minor, he would bring it up repeatedly, using it as evidence of her general incompetence. He kept a running mental inventory of her failures and would cite them as proof that she could not be trusted with important decisions. The cumulative effect of this constant criticism was that Jennifer had lost confidence in her own judgment and found herself seeking Brian's approval before making even small choices. Jennifer's family and friends had noticed changes in her over the years. She had become quieter, more withdrawn, less likely to express opinions or share her thoughts. She apologized excessively, even when she had done nothing wrong. She seemed anxious and on edge, particularly when Brian was present. Several of her close friends had gently tried to express concern about how Brian spoke to her, But Jennifer had defended him, making excuses for his behavior and insisting that he was just direct and that she was probably too sensitive. The truth was that Jennifer had become so accustomed to the abuse that she had normalized it, unable to see clearly that what was happening was not acceptable treatment within a healthy marriage. The invitation to appear on Family Feud had come through Jennifer's sister Rachel, who had applied on behalf of their extended family. Rachel had hoped that a fun, lighthearted experience might bring some joy back into Jennifer's life and perhaps give Brian an opportunity to see his wife in a different context, succeeding at something and being celebrated rather than criticized. The family team would consist of Jennifer and Brian, Rachel, their parents, and Rachel's husband. Everyone had agreed enthusiastically, seeing it as a chance for a memorable family experience. Jennifer had been nervous about the appearance. She worried about making mistakes on camera and about how Brian would react if she gave wrong answers or caused the family to lose points. She had expressed these concerns to Rachel, who had reassured her that it was just a game and that everyone makes mistakes on game shows. What Rachel did not fully understand was the extent to which Jennifer lived in fear of Brian's disapproval and the consequences she faced for any perceived failure. For Jennifer, the game show was not just entertainment. It was another high-stakes situation where her performance would be evaluated and where failure would result in verbal punishment that might last for days or weeks. In the weeks leading up to the taping, Jennifer had studied Family Feud episodes obsessively. She had practiced common questions with her children, made lists of typical answers, and tried to prepare herself as thoroughly as possible. Brian had mocked her preparation efforts, calling her obsessive and saying that she was taking a silly game show too seriously. But Jennifer knew from experience that if she failed to prepare and then made mistakes, Brian would criticize her for not taking it seriously enough. She could not win either way, so she chose the path that at least gave her some sense of control through preparation. What Jennifer did not anticipate was that no amount of preparation could protect her from the unpredictability of live television or from Brian's willingness to verbally eviscerate her in front of millions of viewers when things did not go according to his expectations. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the reality of their marriage in a way that could not be explained away or dismissed as Jennifer being too sensitive. And Steve Harvey, who had witnessed countless family dynamics over his years of hosting, would recognize what he was seeing and make a choice to intervene in defense of someone who had long ago lost the ability to defend herself. The taping took place on a crisp Thursday morning in Los Angeles. The Walsh family team arrived together, though the dynamic was noticeably different from most families who appeared on the show. Jennifer was quiet and deferential, constantly checking with Brian before making even small decisions about where to stand or what to say. Rachel watched her sister with concern, noticing the way Jennifer seemed to shrink in Brian's presence. Their parents, Tom and Susan, maintained cheerful attitudes but exchanged worried glances when they observed the interactions between their daughter and son-in-law. Steve Harvey greeted both families with his characteristic warmth, working his way down the line to meet each contestant. When he reached Jennifer, he asked her what she did for a living. Before Jennifer could answer, Brian interjected loudly that she was a stay-at-home mom, delivering the information with a subtle edge of condescension that suggested this was somehow less than a real occupation. Steve caught the tone, and the way Jennifer's face fell slightly at Brian's interruption. He turned his attention back to Jennifer and asked her directly what she loved most about being a mother. Jennifer's answer was heartfelt, speaking about watching her children grow and being present for the important moments in their lives. Steve responded with genuine warmth, thanking her for the important work she did raising the next generation. When Steve moved on to Brian, he asked about his profession and how long he and Jennifer had been married. Brian spoke confidently about his legal career and mentioned they had been married for 14 years. Steve asked the standard follow-up question about what makes their marriage work. Brian's answer was telling. He said with a laugh that it worked because Jennifer had learned to accept feedback and work on improving herself. The comment was delivered as if it were charming self-deprecation about being particular, but the underlying message was clear to anyone listening carefully. Jennifer's smile was frozen, her body language radiating discomfort. The game began with standard energy and enthusiasm. The first few rounds progressed normally, with both families answering questions and accumulating points. Jennifer had not yet had an opportunity to answer individually, though she had participated in the team huddles where the family discussed strategy. During these huddles, Brian dominated the conversation, dismissing suggestions from other family members and making it clear that he expected his strategic choices to be followed. Rachel tried to include Jennifer in the discussion, but Jennifer deferred to Brian automatically, having learned over years of marriage that disagreeing with him led to consequences that were not worth the temporary satisfaction of asserting her opinion. The critical moment came during the fourth round, when it was Jennifer's turn to provide an answer. The question was to name something people do to relax after a stressful day. Jennifer was at the podium, the spotlight on her, the studio audience waiting for her response. She could feel Brian's eyes on her from where he stood with the family. The pressure was immense. She thought through her options, trying to predict what would be on the board based on her weeks of preparation and study. Jennifer buzzed in and answered, "Take a bath." It was a perfectly reasonable response, something many people do to unwind and relax, but the answer was not on the board. The distinctive X sound effect played, indicating a strike. It was a normal part of the game. Every contestant gives wrong answers occasionally. It was not a catastrophic mistake or even a particularly bad guess. It simply was not one of the responses that had appeared in the survey used for that particular question. The camera cut briefly to the Walsh family's reaction. Rachel and her husband responded with supportive encouragement, the typical response when a family member gives an answer that is not on the board. Jennifer's parents maintained encouraging expressions, but Brian's reaction was dramatically different. His face contorted with anger and disgust. He threw his hands up in exasperation. He shook his head in obvious frustration. And then he did something that crossed a line from disappointment into cruelty. As Jennifer walked back to join the family after her answer, Brian spoke loudly enough for the microphones to catch every word. He said that he could not believe she had studied for weeks and still managed to give such a stupid answer. He said that of course take a bath was not on the board because nobody with any sense would think that was a top answer. He asked her why she could not just think before she spoke for once in her life. The words came rapid fire, each one designed to cut and humiliate. Jennifer's face crumbled. She tried to maintain composure, but tears began streaming down her face almost immediately. The studio fell into uncomfortable silence. The competing family looked shocked and disturbed by what they were witnessing. Rachel moved toward her sister protectively, but Brian was not finished. He continued his verbal assault, saying that this was exactly why he could not trust Jennifer with anything important, that she always found a way to embarrass herself, and by extension him, that he should have known better than to agree to do this show because she could not handle the pressure of performing in public. Jennifer was openly sobbing now, her shoulders shaking, her hands covering her face in shame and devastation. She apologized repeatedly through her tears, saying she was sorry, that she had tried her best, that she did not mean to let everyone down. The apologies came automatically, a conditioned response to Brian's anger that had been reinforced through thousands of similar interactions over the course of their marriage. She was not crying because she had given a wrong answer on a game show. She was crying because she knew what this moment meant. It meant days or possibly weeks of Brian reminding her of this failure, using it as evidence of her inadequacy, holding it over her head as proof that she could not be trusted or relied upon. Steve Harvey had stopped the game entirely. He stood holding his cards, watching this interaction unfold with an expression that shifted from surprise to recognition to anger. He had seen difficult family dynamics before, but this was different. This was not playful family teasing or normal competitive frustration. This was verbal abuse happening in real time on his stage, and he could see the devastating impact it was having on Jennifer. He could see that this was not an isolated incident, but rather a pattern, a dynamic that Jennifer had clearly endured for a long time based on her automatic apologizing and the depth of her emotional collapse over what should have been a minor moment in a game show. Steve made a decision. He walked away from his podium and approached the Walsh family directly. The production crew did not know whether to keep filming or cut to commercial, but Steve's body language made it clear that something significant was happening. He looked directly at Brian with an expression that contained no trace of his usual playful humor. The studio audience was completely silent, sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented. Steve addressed Brian directly in a voice that was controlled but carried an unmistakable edge of anger. He asked Brian if he understood what he had just done. Brian looked confused and defensive, clearly not expecting to be called out for his behavior. He started to respond with justifications, saying that Jennifer knew how much preparation mattered and that he was just frustrated that she had not performed better after all the time she had spent studying. He framed his verbal attack as reasonable frustration rather than acknowledging the cruelty of his words or the disproportionate nature of his response. Steve cut him off. He said that what he had just witnessed was not frustration. It was verbal abuse. He pointed out that Jennifer had given a wrong answer on a game show, something that happened dozens of times in every episode, something completely normal and expected. But Brian's response had been to attack her character, to call her stupid, to humiliate her publicly, and to continue the attack even as she broke down in tears. Steve said that there was no justification for that kind of treatment, that it revealed something deeply wrong in how Brian viewed and treated his wife. Brian attempted to defend himself, saying that Steve did not understand their relationship dynamic and that Jennifer was used to his direct communication style. He suggested that Jennifer was overly emotional and that she took things too personally. He tried to minimize what had happened, framing it as a misunderstanding or an overreaction to normal marital communication. Every word he spoke was a deflection, an attempt to avoid taking responsibility for the harm he had caused. Steve was not accepting the deflection. He turned to Jennifer, who was still crying, and asked her directly if this was how Brian normally spoke to her. Jennifer hesitated, caught between years of conditioning to protect Brian and defend their marriage and the undeniable reality of what had just happened in front of witnesses. She looked at Brian, fear evident in her expression, clearly terrified of how he would react if she told the truth. That fear, that visible terror of her own husband's response, told Steve everything he needed to know about the nature of their relationship. Steve Harvey made a decision that would define this moment and create ripples far beyond a single game show episode. He told the production crew to stop rolling and announced to the studio audience that they needed to take a break from the game. He said that what was happening was more important than any game show competition, and that he would not continue as if everything was normal when it clearly was not. He asked Jennifer's family to join him and Jennifer away from Brian, creating physical space between Jennifer and her husband. Rachel immediately moved to her sister's side, wrapping an arm around her protectively. Tom and Susan flanked their daughter, their faces showing a mixture of concern and guilt as they realized the extent of what Jennifer had been enduring. Steve spoke gently to Jennifer, asking her to take some deep breaths and let him know when she felt ready to talk. When Jennifer had composed herself enough to speak, Steve asked her a direct question. He asked if Brian spoke to her this way regularly. Jennifer struggled to answer, years of minimizing and making excuses, fighting against the truth that was so obvious to everyone watching. Finally, through fresh tears, she admitted that yes, Brian criticized her constantly. He called her stupid regularly. He told her she was incompetent and could not be trusted with decisions. He made fun of her in front of friends and family. He kept detailed mental records of every mistake she made and used those mistakes as evidence that she was fundamentally flawed and inadequate. As Jennifer spoke, it was as if a dam had broken. Years of silence and suppressed pain came pouring out. She talked about how she had lost herself in this marriage, how she no longer trusted her own judgment or believed she was capable of doing anything right. She described the constant state of anxiety she lived in, always trying to anticipate Brian's moods and avoid triggering his anger. She talked about how she had given up her career at his suggestion and how he now used her financial dependence as a weapon, reminding her that she contributed nothing while he paid for everything. She admitted that she had been considering leaving the marriage but felt trapped because she had no income of her own and feared she could not support herself and her children alone. Steve listened to every word without interrupting. When Jennifer finished speaking, he turned to her parents and asked if they had known the extent of what their daughter was experiencing. Tom and Susan looked devastated. Susan admitted that they had seen signs, moments when Brian seemed harsh or dismissive toward Jennifer, but they had not realized how bad it was. She said they had not wanted to interfere in their daughter's marriage, that Jennifer had always defended Brian and insisted things were fine, and they had chosen to believe her rather than push harder and risk pushing her away. The guilt in her voice was palpable as she realized that their desire to respect boundaries had left their daughter suffering alone. Rachel spoke up, her voice shaking with emotion. She said that she had tried to talk to Jennifer about Brian's treatment multiple times over the years. She had pointed out that his criticism was constant and cruel, that his public humiliation of Jennifer was not normal or acceptable. But Jennifer had always made excuses, saying that Brian was just direct, that he had high standards, that she was probably too sensitive. Rachel said she had hoped that bringing the family to Family Feud would give Jennifer a break from the constant criticism, a chance to feel successful and celebrated. Instead, it had exposed the truth of what Jennifer had been living with in a way that could not be denied or explained away. Steve Harvey then did something that surprised everyone. He invited Brian back into the conversation, but not to attack him or continue the confrontation in an aggressive manner. Instead, Steve spoke to Brian about the nature of verbal abuse and its impact. He explained that many people, particularly men, grow up believing that verbal aggression is not real abuse because it does not leave physical marks. But the psychological damage caused by constant criticism, humiliation, and contempt can be just as devastating as physical violence, sometimes even more so because it attacks the victim's sense of self-worth and identity. Steve told Brian that what he had witnessed in those few minutes on stage was a pattern of behavior that constituted emotional abuse. He went through the characteristics: the constant criticism, the public humiliation, the undermining of confidence, the financial control, the keeping score of mistakes, the refusal to take responsibility when confronted. He said that every single one of these patterns had been evident in the brief interactions they had witnessed during the taping. He pointed out that Jennifer's extreme emotional reaction to a minor wrong answer was not evidence that she was overly sensitive. It was evidence that she had been subjected to this kind of attack so many times that she had developed a trauma response to Brian's disapproval. Brian's response was defensive and revealing. He insisted that he had never hit Jennifer, as if the absence of physical violence meant his behavior was acceptable. He said that he had high standards and that holding Jennifer to those standards was not abuse. It was pushing her to be better. He claimed that Jennifer was actually lucky to have someone who cared enough to point out her flaws and help her improve. Every justification he offered was a textbook example of how abusers rationalize their behavior, reframing cruelty as care and control as concern. Steve responded with a combination of firmness and an attempt at education. He told Brian that having high standards for yourself is fine, but using those standards as a weapon to constantly criticize and demean your spouse is not motivation. It is abuse. He explained that healthy relationships involve building each other up, not tearing each other down. He said that if Brian's goal was truly to help Jennifer improve, his methods were having the opposite effect. He pointed out that Jennifer had described losing confidence in her own judgment and abilities, which was the direct result of years of Brian telling her she was incompetent and untrustworthy. Steve then addressed Jennifer again, speaking to her with compassion but also with directness. He told her that what she had described was not a healthy marriage. He said that she deserved to be treated with respect and kindness, that making mistakes did not make her stupid or incompetent, and that her husband's treatment of her was not her fault or something she had brought on herself by failing to meet his standards. He told her that many people watching would recognize themselves in her story, and that speaking the truth about what she had been experiencing might give others the courage to name their own situations. He also spoke to Jennifer about the practical realities she faced. He acknowledged that leaving an abusive relationship was complicated, particularly when there were children involved and when financial dependence created additional barriers. He said that he was not going to tell her what to do with her marriage, but he wanted her to know that resources existed to help women in her situation. He encouraged her to reach out to domestic violence organizations that specialized in helping victims of emotional abuse develop safety plans and build paths toward independence. The production crew had continued filming this entire interaction, recognizing that they were capturing something important. The other competing family, the studio audience, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing a moment that transcended entertainment. This was real pain being acknowledged, real harm being named, and real intervention happening in defense of someone who needed protection and support. Steve made one final statement before they concluded the taping. He spoke directly to the camera, addressing the viewing audience at home. He said that Family Feud was typically a show about fun and family bonding, but what had happened today was a reminder that not all families are healthy, and that sometimes what looks perfect from the outside hides serious problems. He encouraged viewers who recognized themselves in Jennifer's story to reach out for help. He provided information about the National Domestic Violence Hotline and emphasized that emotional abuse is real abuse that deserves to be taken seriously. The episode that aired 6 weeks later included extensive disclaimers and was presented with special framing. The producers made the unprecedented decision to air the full interaction, including Steve Harvey's intervention and the family conversation that followed. They included resources at the beginning and end of the episode for viewers experiencing domestic violence, and they prepared support staff to handle the anticipated volume of calls and emails in response to the content. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the episode airing, the National Domestic Violence Hotline reported a significant spike in calls from people identifying as victims of emotional abuse. Many callers specifically referenced Jennifer's story, saying they had been experiencing similar treatment from partners, but had not recognized it as abuse until they saw Jennifer's breakdown and Steve's explanation of the patterns. The episode became a cultural touchstone, sparking national conversations about emotional abuse, verbal cruelty in relationships, and the ways that psychological harm can be just as devastating as physical violence. Public response was complex and divided. Many viewers praised Steve Harvey for his willingness to intervene and to use his platform to educate about emotional abuse. They appreciated that he had taken Jennifer's pain seriously and had refused to continue with the game as if nothing was wrong. Domestic violence advocates lauded the episode for bringing attention to forms of abuse that often go unrecognized and unaddressed. They noted that emotional abuse frequently precedes physical violence and that naming these patterns early can be life-saving. However, there was also significant criticism. Some argued that airing the episode was exploitative, that it took Jennifer's private pain and trauma and turned it into entertainment for millions of viewers. They suggested that the intervention should have happened off-camera and that broadcasting Jennifer's breakdown was a violation of her dignity regardless of the educational value. Others maintained that family issues should be handled privately and that public interventions like this one created more harm than healing by humiliating both Jennifer and Brian on a national stage. For Jennifer herself, the immediate aftermath was both terrifying and liberating. She separated from Brian 2 days after the taping, before the episode even aired. The intervention had given her a sudden clarity about the reality of her situation that she could not unsee or rationalize away. Rachel welcomed Jennifer and her children into her home, providing a safe place for them to stay while Jennifer figured out her next steps. Jennifer's parents were devastated by their failure to recognize and address the abuse earlier, but they rallied to support their daughter through the difficult transition. Brian's response followed a predictable pattern for abusers who are publicly exposed. He was furious about what he called betrayal and public humiliation. He hired an attorney immediately and made threats about custody and financial consequences if Jennifer proceeded with separation. He positioned himself as the victim of a manufactured crisis created by Steve Harvey's interference and by Jennifer's emotional instability. He told friends and colleagues that Jennifer had blown everything out of proportion and that the whole situation had been taken out of context by an overzealous game show host looking for dramatic television. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated and contentious. Brian fought aggressively on every issue, using litigation as a form of continued control and punishment. He attempted to paint Jennifer as mentally unstable and an unfit mother, using her emotional breakdown on Family Feud as evidence. However, Jennifer's attorney was able to present evidence of Brian's pattern of verbal abuse, including testimony from friends and family members who had witnessed his treatment of Jennifer over the years. The judge presiding over the case had seen the Family Feud episode and recognized the dynamics at play. She ruled in Jennifer's favor on the majority of issues, granting her primary custody of the children and ordering Brian to pay substantial spousal and child support. The year following the episode was extraordinarily difficult for Jennifer. She experienced significant trauma responses as she processed the abuse she had endured for more than a decade. She worked with a therapist who specialized in domestic violence recovery and slowly began to rebuild her sense of self and her confidence in her own judgment. She joined a support group for survivors of emotional abuse and found community with other women who understood exactly what she had experienced. She gradually reclaimed aspects of herself that she had lost during her marriage, rediscovering interests and capabilities that had been systematically undermined by Brian's constant criticism. Jennifer also began speaking publicly about her experience. She gave interviews to news outlets and appeared on talk shows to discuss emotional abuse and the importance of recognizing its signs and patterns. She partnered with domestic violence organizations to create educational materials specifically focused on psychological abuse. She was careful in these appearances to emphasize that her story was just one example, and that abuse takes many forms. but she hoped that by sharing her experience, she might help others recognize their own situations and seek help before the damage became irreparable. Steve Harvey addressed the episode, and its aftermath on his talk show multiple times over the following months. He stood by his decision to intervene, saying that he had a moral obligation to address what he recognized as abuse happening on his stage. He acknowledged the criticism that airing the episode might have been exploitative, but he maintained that the educational value and the potential to help other victims outweighed those concerns. He noted that he had consulted with Jennifer before the episode aired and that she had given her consent and had actually wanted her story shared if it might help others. Steve also spoke about the letters and messages he had received from viewers who said the episode had changed or saved their lives. He read some of these messages on air, with permission from the senders. There were stories from women who had left abusive relationships after recognizing their own experiences in Jennifer's breakdown. There were messages from men who said they had realized they were behaving like Brian and had sought help to change their patterns before losing their families. There were testimonials from adult children who had grown up watching one parent abuse the other, and who had used the episode to finally have conversations with the victimized parent about leaving. The professional consequences for Brian were significant. Several colleagues who had seen the episode began paying more attention to how he treated support staff and junior attorneys at his firm. Patterns of verbal aggression and demeaning behavior that had previously been dismissed as high standards or intensity were suddenly recognized as potentially problematic. He faced an internal review and was ultimately asked to participate in anger management counseling as a condition of continued employment. His professional reputation, which he had worked so hard to protect, was significantly damaged by the public exposure of his private behavior. 2 years after the episode aired, Jennifer had rebuilt her life in ways she had not thought possible during her marriage. She had returned to work part-time in marketing, finding that her skills and confidence returned more quickly than she had expected once she was in an environment where her contributions were valued rather than criticized. She had established a stable home for her children, who were thriving in an environment free from the tension and verbal cruelty that had characterized their household when Brian lived there. She had started dating cautiously, approaching new relationships with much greater awareness of red flags and unhealthy patterns. Jennifer also became an advocate and educator about emotional abuse. She co-authored a book with a psychologist about recognizing and recovering from psychological abuse in intimate relationships. The book combined clinical information about abuse dynamics with Jennifer's personal narrative and practical guidance for victims seeking to leave abusive situations. The book became a resource used by domestic violence shelters and therapists working with abuse survivors. Jennifer found purpose and healing in transforming her painful experience into something that could help others. The broader cultural impact of the episode was significant and lasting. It contributed to growing public awareness about emotional abuse as a serious form of domestic violence. It helped shift conversations about abuse beyond physical violence to include the psychological harm caused by verbal cruelty, humiliation, and control. Mental health professionals reported that more clients were coming to therapy specifically to address emotionally abusive relationships, citing the Family Feud episode as the moment they first recognized that what they were experiencing had a name and was not their fault. The episode also sparked important conversations about intervention and bystander responsibility. Many viewers expressed regret about times they had witnessed similar dynamics in their own social circles, but had remained silent because they did not want to interfere or did not know how to help. Steve Harvey's intervention provided a model, however imperfect, for how to name abusive behavior when we witness it, and how to support victims in recognizing that the treatment they are receiving is not acceptable or normal. Educational institutions began using clips from the episode in courses about domestic violence, relationship health, and gender-based violence. The combination of Jennifer's visible trauma response, Brian's rationalizations and deflections, and Steve's clear naming of the abuse dynamics made it a powerful teaching tool. Students studying psychology, social work, counseling, and related fields analyze the interaction to better understand how emotional abuse manifests and how intervention can occur. 3 years after the episode, Jennifer was invited back to Family Feud as part of a special segment featuring people whose lives had been changed by their appearances on the show. She returned with her children, her sister Rachel, and her parents, a reconstituted family team free from the presence of her ex-husband. The atmosphere was completely different. Jennifer was visibly more confident, her body language open and relaxed rather than tense and fearful. When Steve Harvey greeted her, they embraced warmly and she thanked him for saving her life. She told him that his intervention had given her permission to acknowledge the truth about her marriage and had provided the catalyst she needed to finally leave. During that return episode, Jennifer spoke about her journey over the past 3 years. She talked about the difficulty of rebuilding her life, the fear and uncertainty that had accompanied her decision to leave, and the slow process of healing from years of psychological abuse. She also talked about the unexpected gifts that had emerged from the pain, the deeper relationships with her children who no longer had to witness her being verbally attacked, the reconnection with her own interests and capabilities, and the purpose she had found in helping other women escape similar situations. Steve Harvey asked Jennifer what she would say to women watching who might be in relationships similar to what she had experienced. Jennifer's answer was clear and powerful. She said that emotional abuse is real abuse, that verbal cruelty causes genuine psychological damage, and that no amount of financial security or fear of being alone justifies staying in a relationship where you are treated with contempt rather than respect. She acknowledged that leaving is difficult and complicated, particularly when there are children and financial dependencies involved, but she emphasized that it is possible and that resources exist to help. She told viewers that they deserve to be treated with kindness and that their abuser's criticism of them was a reflection of the abuser's character, not their own worth. The family played the game during that return appearance, and Jennifer's participation was joyful and uninhibited. When she gave a wrong answer during one round, she laughed it off naturally, a stark contrast to the breakdown that had occurred 3 years earlier. The family celebrated each other's contributions without criticism or judgment, demonstrating what healthy family dynamics looked like. They did not win the game that day, but they won something more important, the chance to show millions of viewers what healing and recovery looked like, the proof that it was possible to rebuild after abuse. The story of Jennifer Walsh's appearance on Family Feud became one of those rare moments where entertainment television served a genuine social good. It brought visibility to a form of abuse that too often remains hidden behind closed doors. It sparked countless conversations in households across America about what constitutes acceptable treatment in relationships. It gave victims a vocabulary for naming their experiences and the courage to seek help. And it demonstrated that intervention, however uncomfortable, is sometimes the most loving thing we can do for someone trapped in an abusive situation. If this story has resonated with you, if you recognize yourself or someone you love in Jennifer's experience, please know that help is available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached at any time for support, information, and resources. Emotional abuse is real, it causes genuine harm, and you deserve to be treated with respect and kindness in your relationships. If this story has moved you or given you something to think about, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories matter because they give voice to experiences that too many people suffer through in silence. Jennifer Walsh often reflects on that day at the Family Feud studio as the worst and best day of her life. It was the worst because her pain and trauma were exposed so publicly, because she could no longer maintain the facade that everything was fine, because she had to face the reality of her situation in front of millions of witnesses. But it was also the best because it forced a reckoning that she might not have found the courage to pursue on her own, because Steve Harvey's intervention gave her external validation that what she was experiencing was wrong, and because it ultimately led her to freedom and healing. Steve Harvey has said in multiple interviews that intervening in Jennifer's situation was one of the most important things he has done in his career. He knew in the moment that speaking up would be controversial, and that some would criticize him for interfering in family business. But he also knew that silence in the face of abuse makes us complicit in that abuse. He chose to use his platform and his position of authority to defend someone who had lost the ability to defend herself. He has received thousands of letters from abuse survivors thanking him for that choice, and he considers those letters among his most treasured possessions. The legacy of that Family Feud episode is ultimately a reminder that how we treat each other in our most intimate relationships matters profoundly. Words have power to build up or tear down, to heal or harm. The choice to speak with kindness rather than cruelty, to offer encouragement rather than constant criticism, to treat our partners with respect rather than contempt is a choice we make every single day. And when we witness someone being verbally abused, We have a choice about whether to remain silent or to speak up in defense of their dignity and worth. Jennifer's story reminds us that speaking up, however uncomfortable it may be, is always the right choice.